Did I hit him? The question would be one of the most debatable statements in modern true crime. Because a Boston officer was dead. His body was found lying in the snow during a brutal Massachusetts winter storm. A woman stood beside him, terrified, confused, frantic. That woman was Karen Reed. Within days, investigators would accuse her of doing the unthinkable. Prosecutors would eventually argue that she backed her SUV into her boyfriend, left him in the snow during a blizzard, and drove away. But almost immediately, questions began to emerge. Questions about the evidence, questions about the investigation, questions about the people involved. And before long, an entire nation found itself divided over a single question. Was Karen Reed a murderer? Or was she being blamed for something she didn't do? What followed would become one of the most controversial criminal cases in recent American history. A case involving a dead police officer, a bitter legal battle, claims of investigative misconduct, and two completely different versions of the same night. Tonight's case shocked an entire nation, but like every crime, there was a reason. Welcome to the Voice of Reason. Before there was a trial, before there were television cameras, before there were courtroom battles, there was a relationship. Karen Reed was a former financial analyst and adjunct professor living in Massachusetts. John O'Keefe was a respected Boston police officer. By all award appearances, they looked like a normal couple. But like many relationships, the reality was more complicated. Friends described periods of happiness. Others described tension, arguments, disagreements, questions about where the relationship was heading. By January of 2022, Karen and John had been together for several years. And according to testimony that would later emerge during the trials, their relationship had experienced its share of ups and downs. Still, nobody could predict where things were heading. Because on January 28th, 2022, the couple would go out for what would appear to be a normal night with friends. It would be the last night John O'Keefe would ever be alive. January in Massachusetts is unforgiving. Cold winds, snow-covered roads, and this particular night, a winter storm was moving into the area. But despite the weather, Karen and John spent the evening socializing. They visited bars, met with friends, drank alcohol, and like countless couples across America, they moved from one gathering to another as the night unfolded. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Nothing suggested that this evening would end up in tragedy. But as the hours passed, conditions outside worsened. The snow intensified, visibility dropped, roads became more dangerous, and somewhere within that increasingly chaotic night, investigators believe the events leading to John's death began unfolding. The challenge was that nobody agreed on exactly what happened. Not investigators, not the defense, not the public, and eventually, not even the jurors. As the evening continued, Karen and John eventually made their way. The home belonged to people known within local law enforcement circles. A gathering was taking place. Several people were inside. The plan seemed simple. John would go inside. Karen would either join or leave him afterwards. But what happened next would become the central mystery of the entire case. According to prosecutors, Karen dropped John off outside the residence. Then, after an argument and a night of drinking, she allegedly struck him with her Lexus SUV. The prosecution would later argue that she reversed the vehicle, hit John, and left him behind in the snow. But the defense saw things very differently. Karen maintained that she never hit John with her vehicle. Her attorney argues that investigators became fixated on her and ignored alternative possibilities. And from that moment forward, the case split into two competing stories, two competing realities, two explanations for the same death. One side believed that the evidence clearly pointed to Karen Reed. The other side believed investigators reached the wrong conclusion from the very beginning. And somewhere in the middle, a man was dead. Now, as the night wore on, the snow continued falling. Temperatures dropped. Roads became increasingly dangerous. Meanwhile, something else was happening. John O'Keefe never came home. At first, there have been many explanations. Maybe he stayed with friends. Maybe his phone died. Maybe plans changed. But as the hours passed, concern began turning into panic. You see, Karen became worried, then frightened, then desperate. The man she expected to hear from was suddenly gone. No calls, no texts, no answers. And with every passing hour, the possibility that something terrible had happened became harder to ignore. What Karen didn't know was that before the sun rose, John O'Keefe would be discovered lying in the snow, unresponsive, critically injured, and fighting for his life. The discovery would trigger an investigation that would eventually consume national headlines. But at that moment, nobody knew they were standing at the beginning of one of the most controversial criminal cases in modern America. In the early morning hours of January 29, 2022, panic began settling in as John O'Keefe was still missing. Karen Reed had not heard from him. Calls went unanswered. Messages were unanswered. And as concern grew, Karen began searching for him. What happened during those early morning hours would later become a major focus of both trials. According to testimony, Karen contacted friends and began trying to determine where John might be. At first, there was confusion, then fear, then a growing realization that something was terribly wrong. As the search continued, they returned to the area near the Fairview Road residence. The snowstorm was still raging. Visibility remained poor. Snow covered the ground, and then they saw something, a shape, a body, lying in the snow. John O'Keefe had been found. Emergency responders rushed to the scene, but the situation was already dire. The veteran officer was unresponsive, critically injured, and suffering from exposure to the freezing weather. The effort to save him would ultimately fail. John O'Keefe was pronounced dead almost immediately. Investigators began asking the most important questions. How did he get here? In many criminal investigations, there's a moment that changes everything. A statement, a piece of evidence, a witness observation, something that shapes the direction of the case. For Karen Reed, that moment became one of the most discussed statements in modern true crime. According to testimony presented during the case, Karen repeatedly asked questions that investigators viewed as significant. Among those alleged statements were, "Did I hit him?" The prosecution viewed the statement as evidence of consciousness of guilt. To them, it suggested Karen already knew what had happened. Then, she was worried because she had struck John with her vehicle. But the defense saw the statement very differently. Imagine finding someone you love lying unconscious in the snow. Imagine the confusion, the shock, the panic, the fear. The defense argued that Karen's statement reflected exactly that. a frightened woman desperately trying to understand what had happened. Not a confession, not an admission, but a question. And that distinction would become enormously important because throughout this entire case, nearly every piece of evidence would have two competing interpretations. And which interpretations a person believed would determine which side of the case that they supported. As investigators processed the scene, attention quickly turned toward Karen Reed. She had been with John that night. She had driven him to the gathering. She had been among the people who discovered him. And according to investigators, evidence began pointing towards her vehicle, specifically her Lexus SUV. Prosecutors would later argue that Karen struck John with the vehicle after a night of drinking. According to the state's attorney, the collision caused injuries that ultimately contributed to his death. Then came another important piece of evidence, a damaged taillight. Investigators discovered that part of Karen's rear taillight was broken. Then, prosecution believed that the damage supported their theory and John's injuries resulted from being struck by the SUV. Well, to prosecutors, the evidence fit together. A damaged vehicle, a deceased victim, and statements made after the discovery, and a timeline that appeared to place Karen at the center of the event. But not everyone agreed. In fact, disagreement would become the defining feature of this entire case. Now, one of the reasons that Karen Reed's case became a national obsession was because two dramatically different versions of events emerged. The prosecutor's version was straightforward. Karen and John had been drinking. An argument occurred. Karen backed her vehicle into John. She left him in the snow, and she drove away. Simple, direct, and easy to understand. But the defense presented a completely different explanation. Karen maintained she never hit John with her SUV. Her attorney argued investigators became locked into theory too early and ignored alternative possibilities. According to the defense, key questions remain unanswered. How did John receive his injuries? What happened after he arrived at the residence? Were investigators looking at all possibilities? Or had they focused exclusively on Karen from the beginning? Those questions transformed the case from a typical homicide prosecution into something much larger. Because now the trial wasn't only about Karen Reed. It was also about the investigation itself. As the case moved forward, one of the key pieces of evidence became almost symbolic. The taillight. To prosecutors, it presented physical proof. Evidence that Karen's SUV had struck John. Evidence supporting the state's entire theory. But to the defense, the taillight became a source of controversy. Questions emerged about the evidence collection. Questions emerged about the timing. Questions emerged about how certain pieces of evidence were discovered. As the month passed, the taillight evidence evolved into something larger than a broken vehicle component. It became a symbol of the entire case. Supporters of the prosecutors viewed it as proof. Supporters of Karen Reed viewed it as evidence that required greater scrutiny. And once again, the public found itself divided, looking at the same evidence, reaching completely different conclusions. Now, most criminal cases remain local stories. They affect a family, a neighborhood, a community. Then they fade from public attention. This case did the opposite. The death of a Boston police officer, the accusations against his girlfriend, questions surroundings in the investigation, claims of misconduct, conflicting expert testimony. Every new development generated more attention. Television networks discovered it. Podcasts analyzed it. YouTube channels debated it. Online communities dissected every detail. Before long, the Karen Reed case had become something far bigger than a Massachusetts homicide prosecution. It had become a national true crime phenomenon. And the deeper people looked into the evidence, the more divided they became. Some believed Karen Reed was obviously guilty. Others believed she was obviously innocent. And very few people seemed to exist anywhere in between. But the legal system doesn't operate on public opinion. It operates on evidence. And soon 12 jurors would be asked to decide which version of the story they believed. As prosecutors prepared their case, many believed the outcome would be straightforward. A police officer was dead. A suspect had been identified. Evidence had been collected. Charges had been filed. But once testimony begins, something unexpected happened. The deeper the public looked into the case, the more complicated it became. Witnesses testified, experts analyzed evidence, attorneys challenged conclusions, and with every passing day, the gap between the prosecution's theory and the defense's theory just seemed to grow wider. Supporters of Karen Reed watched closely. Supporters of John O'Keefe's family watched just as closely. Each side believed the evidence supported its position. Each side believed justice was on its side. And as the trial unfolded, it became increasingly clear that this case was anything but simple. One of the most important concepts in criminal law is also one of the most misunderstood. Something called reasonable doubt. You see, the prosecution does not have to prove a case beyond all doubt, but they must prove it beyond reasonable doubt. That standard exists for a reason, because the consequences of a wrongful conviction are enormous. Throughout the trial, the defense focused heavily on creating doubt, not wild speculation, not impossible theories, reasonable doubt. They challenged the interpretation of forensic evidence. They challenged witness testimony. They challenged the timeline, and they challenged the assumption that the investigators had correctly identified what happened to John O'Keefe. The defense did not need to prove exactly what happened. They only needed to convince jurors that prosecutors had failed to eliminate reasonable doubt. And for many observers, that became the central battle of the case. Not guilty versus innocence, but certainty versus uncertainty. After weeks of testimony and arguments, the case finally went to the jury. The evidence had been presented, the witnesses had spoken, and attorneys had made their final arguments. Now, 12 jurors were tasked with reaching a unanimous verdict, but unanimity never came. Jurors deliberated, reviewed evidence, discussed testimony, and attempted to reach agreement. Yet, despite the efforts, they remained divided. Some jurors viewed the evidence one way, others viewed it differently. Eventually, the judge declared a mistrial. The jury had failed to reach a unanimous verdict. The case, however, was not over. The question remained unanswered, and the controversy only grew. For Karen Reed supporters, the mistrial suggested serious weakness in the prosecution's case. For critics, it meant the fight for justice was not finished. Instead of ending the debate, the mistrial intensified it. And as public attention increased, another issue began, attracting national scrutiny: the conduct of lead investigator Michael Proctor. Questions surrounding Proctor became one of the most controversial aspects of this case. The defense argued that concerns about the lead investigator undermined confidence in the investigation itself. Critics questioned whether the investigation had been conducted fairly. Supporters of the prosecution argued that the focus should remain on the evidence, regardless of which side of the people supported. The controversy created a major problem: trust. Criminal investigations depend heavily on trust. Jurors must trust investigators. The prosecutors must trust the investigators. And when questions arise about investigative conduct, confidence can begin to erode. Now, the defense understood this and they used those concerns to challenge the credibility of the investigation. As a result, the conversation shifted. People were no longer debating only what happened to John O'Keefe. They were also debating whether the investigation itself deserved confidence. Now, by the time prosecutors began for a retrial, something unusual had happened. The Karen Reed case had evolved into more than a criminal prosecution. It had become a movement. See, supporters gathered outside court proceedings. Social media communities formed. Podcasts dedicated countless hours to analyzing evidence. Again, YouTube channels examined every witness and every statement. The case had become a national true crime phenomenon. For some people, Karen Reed represented a woman fighting against a flawed investigation. For others, she remained the woman prosecutors accused of causing John O'Keefe's death. And somewhere between those two perspectives sat the facts. Facts that would soon be presented to another jury. Facts that would once again be tested in court. Facts that would determine whether Karen Reed walked free or faced the possibility of spending the rest of her life behind bars. And the retrial was coming, and the entire country would be watching. By the time the retrial began in 2025, the Karen Reed case had already become one of the most debatable criminal prosecutions in America. Every motion, every witness, every piece of evidence, every courtroom exchange was being watched, analyzed, and argued about. Supporters packed courtrooms. News crews lined the streets. Legal analysis dissected every development. This wasn't just another criminal trial anymore. It had become a national spectacle. And yet beneath all of the attention remained the same fundamental question. What happened to John O'Keefe? For prosecutors, the answer had never changed. Karen Reed had struck him with her Lexus SUV after a night of drinking and left him outside in the snow. For the defense, the answer was equally clear. The investigation had reached the wrong conclusion. The evidence did not prove Karen caused John's death, and investigators failed to properly examine alternative possibilities. Now, 12 new jurors would once again hear the evidence and once again decide which version of events that they believed. Throughout the retrial, prosecutors worked to reinforce the theory they had maintained from the beginning. According to the state, the evidence pointed directly towards Karen Reed. They relied heavily on vehicle data, cell phone records, witness testimony, and physical evidence associated with Karen's SUV. The prosecution argued that John's injuries were consistent with being struck by a vehicle. They pointed to the damaged taillight. They pointed to the statements allegedly made by Karen after John's body was discovered. And they argued that when all of the evidence was viewed together, it told a clear story. A story of reckless conduct, a story of alcohol impairment, a story that ended with John O'Keefe lying in the snow. And to prosecutors, the evidence fit. The challenge was convincing jurors that it fit beyond a reasonable doubt, because the defense wasn't merely challenging one piece of evidence. They were challenging nearly all of it. And most criminal defense teams focus on creating doubt about specific evidence. Karen Reed's defense team did something larger. They challenged the investigation itself. From the beginning, defense attorneys argued investigators became focused on Karen too quickly. They claimed alternative possibilities were not properly explored. They question evidence handling. They question witness credibility. They question investigative decisions. And perhaps most importantly, they questioned whether the investigation deserved the jury's trust. The defense argued that before jurors could convict Karen Reed, they first had to believe the investigation had been conducted properly. And if investigators made serious mistakes, if evidence was mishandled, if important questions remained unanswered, then reasonable doubt existed. And if reasonable doubt existed, the law required acquittal. That strategy would prove enormously influential because by the end of the retrial, many observers believed the case had become just as much about the investigation as it was about Karen Reed herself. One of the most controversial aspects of the case involved allegations surrounding lead investigator Michael Proctor. The issue became a major focus during proceedings. For supporters of Karen Reed, questions surrounding the lead investigator reinforced concerns about the integrity of the investigation, and for prosecutors, the focus maintained on the evidence itself. Regardless of which side of people supported, the controversy created additional scrutiny, and additional scrutiny creates additional doubt. Jurors were focused to consider not only the evidence presented in court again, but the credibility of the people who collected it. That distinction mattered because criminal investigations require competence, and competence becomes difficult when significant questions exist about the investigative process. Eventually, the testimony ended, and arguments ended, and the experts finished speaking, and the lawyer sat down, and the case belonged to the jury. Again, 12 citizens entered the deliberation room carrying one of the heaviest responsibilities in the justice system. They weren't deciding what social media believed. They weren't deciding what television commentators believed. They weren't deciding what either legal team wanted. They were deciding whether prosecutors had proven the case beyond a reasonable doubt. The burden was not on Karen Reed to prove innocence. The burden was on the state to prove guilt. And that burden is intentionally high because the consequences, again, of getting it wrong are enormous. And hours had passed, then days. The jury reviewed evidence, discussed testimony, examined competing explanations, and worked towards a decision that would bring one of the most closely watched criminal trials in America to an end. And on June 18th, 2025, the verdict finally arrived. The courtroom fell silent. Everyone understood the significance of the moment. Karen Reed stood waiting. John O'Keefe's loved ones waited. Attorneys waited. Supporters waited. Then the judge spoke. Not guilty of second-degree murder. Not guilty of manslaughter. Not guilty of leaving the scene of an accident causing death. The jury acquitted Karen Reed of every homicide-related charge. The only conviction was operating under the influence of alcohol. Legally, the verdict was clear. The prosecution had failed to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Karen Reed caused John O'Keefe's death. Now, for supporters, the verdict represented justice. For her critics, it represented a failure to hold someone accountable, and once again, America remained divided. Now understand, you guys, one of the most misunderstood aspects of criminal law is the meaning of a not guilty verdict. A not guilty verdict does not answer every question. It does not solve every mystery. And it does not necessarily tell the public exactly what happened. What it does mean is something very specific. The prosecution failed to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. That was the conclusion reached by the jury. Nothing more, nothing less. And in the Karen Reed case, The distinction became the center of everything. Because while the legal case ended, the public debate did not. People still believed prosecutors were correct. Many people still believe investigators got it wrong. And many people continue searching for answers about what happened to John O'Keefe that snowy night. You guys, the Karen Reed case became a national phenomenon because it forced people to confront an uncomfortable reality. Sometimes the evidence can lead intelligent people to completely different conclusions. Some saw a straightforward homicide case, and others saw a flawed investigation, but on assumptions. Some trusted the prosecution, others trusted the defense. But ultimately, the legal system asked a narrower question. Not did something tragic happen. Not was John O'Keefe's death heartbreaking. Not are there still unanswered questions. The question was, did prosecutors prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Karen Reed caused his death? A jury answered that question, and their answer changed the course of the case forever. John O'Keefe lost his life. Families on every side were devastated. A community was divided. And a nation spent years arguing over the same set of facts. Yet, after all the testimony, after all the evidence, after all the accusations, one truth remained. The search for answers can be every bit as complicated as the crime itself. And after everything investigators uncovered, one thing became painfully clear. Every crime has a reason. Once again, you guys, this is the Voice of Reason. I am Reason. Thank you for hanging out with me this evening. This Karen Reed, John O'Keefe case was absolutely tragic. I have another good one coming for you. Don't forget to hit that like, share, and subscribe button. The next case is going to be incredible. Have a good night.